Sean shared a little bit about how I have 2 degrees in theology, and when I was choosing where I was going to go, what career path I was going to pursue, and started thinking seriously about children's ministry, it seemed a little bit laughable to many of my friends. Theology and children's ministry didn't really seem to mix. Children's ministry was often seen as an easy ministry. You're just babysitting, you're just taking care of the kids, you're teaching them the basics. Why would you have taken the time to do a bachelor's degree and a master's degree if you're just going to teach the kids? Well, I believe that children's ministry is so important and significant. And in fact, it's the training ground for many of our kids to experience a faith foundation. In fact, I believe that what kids learn in their early years is formative to their faith as they grow. It helps them to grow, it helps them to learn, it helps them to really know who Jesus is. And in fact, I believe that a lack of theological teaching in these early years can result in a lack of practical faith. If you're like me and where I'm in Canada, we're consistently hearing stats about how kids are walking away from the faith. Kids are asking hard questions and they're not able to find the answers. And I believe that teaching theology, even from the time they're toddlers and preschoolers, can make a huge difference and an impact in their lives. So tonight, for a few minutes, I just want to look at 2 quick pieces of theological teaching. The first one is, what do we mean when we say theology? When we talk about theology in relation to kids, what does that look like? And the second thing I want to look at, of course, is the how. How do we teach kids theology? How do we do it? We all are busy. We all have so many things on our plate in kids ministry. So how do we make this work? Well, before we go there, let's just quickly talk about the what is theology. What are we even talking about? If you're like me and you have a theological degree, this might seem like an easy question, but maybe you're new to this idea. So I like to define theology in a definition that's not original to me. In fact, it's stolen from one of my favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton. And he says this: theology is simply the part of religion that requires us to use our brains. Simple but profound. Theology is what we do when we think about God and ask the hard questions. In fact, I like to tell people all the time, theology is simply asking the question, who is God? What do we know about him? And why does it matter? If you think about it in this way, we're doing theology all the time. We do theology when we teach a Sunday morning children's church lesson. We're doing it when we teach Sunday school. We're doing it in our midweek programs. Even when we read our kids' Bible stories before they go to sleep, we're doing theology. So I believe that the first step to teaching theology to kids is understanding we're actually doing it all the time. We're actually practicing it more than we think, and we just need to be a little bit more intentional in what we do and how we do it. And at its heart, I don't believe theology is simply an academic practice. I don't believe it's just simply a brain practice. In fact, I believe that theology done well, should lead us into a deeper and a more profound relationship with God. So, how do we do it? How do we teach kids theology? If the kids in your ministry are anything like the kids in my ministry, they are running around crazy, they're hyped up, they have so many questions, it feels hard to just get through a 15-minute lesson, let alone invest theological truth in them. It's true, teaching theology to kids is not always easy. However, I believe there are 3 simple things we can do that will teach kids theology and teach them well. Here's the first one. Start small. Nothing profound, nothing brand new, but an important truth. Sometimes, and I was like this when I first started in children's ministry, I was so excited to teach kids theology that I tried to give them way more they could handle, my leaders way more than they could handle, and honestly, it was more than even I could handle. So start small. What I recommend people do and what I do today is to take my children's ministry calendar and look at it and choose 1 or 2 big questions about God that I want to answer for the year. That's it. I don't try to teach them the whole Apostles' Creed, the whole constitution of our fellowship in just 1 year, 1 month. I try to pick 1 or 2 topics and spread them out over the year. So this year, for example, we're looking at the names of God and the promises of God. How do we know God will keep his promises? What is God's character? What is he like? And that's what we're looking at this year. When you just pick those 1 or 2 topics, I also recommend breaking them down in small, digestible chunks. Don't try to give kids more than they can handle. Don't try to give them more than they can digest in 5-minute, 10-minute chunks. Give them important, significant truths, but in small ways. I believe, and I've started saying this more and more lately, kids can learn hard things. They can. But we don't have to teach them in hard ways. And one of the ways we can make sure that we're not teaching them in hard ways is to start small. The second thing that I encourage people to do is to encourage questions. If you have done children's ministry for any length of time, you will know kids love to ask questions. They love asking questions, and they will always catch you off guard. I share this story often when I talk about this with other children's pastors. A couple years ago, when I was still pretty new in children's ministry, I was teaching the story of Noah's Ark to a group of primary kids. Straightforward story. God always keeps his promises. The rainbow shows us the sign. Until a little boy who's from a racial minority in my children's ministry piped up and said, "Hey, Pastor Julia, if God wiped out everyone in the flood, where did all the different races come from?" Let me tell you, it knocked the wind right out of my sails. I did not know where to go. I didn't know what to say. And I had to look at him and say, "Thanks for asking the question, but I need to get back to you on that." However, I didn't want to squash his excitement. I didn't want to squash his heart for asking questions and wanting to know more about the Bible and God. It is so important to encourage kids to ask questions. There are 2 ways that I do this in my children's ministry often. The first one is doing something I call a question box. Be warned, this can get scary and it can get messy. But here's what it looks like in our children's ministry. When we're discussing a particular topic, whether it be creation, whether it be Jesus, whether it be the Holy Spirit, I put a question box in the front of our classroom, and every week at the end of our lesson, I give kids a couple of minutes if they have a question to write it down. I do this for 2 reasons. The first one is sometimes kids are nervous to ask questions in front of a group. However, if you have a question box, they can write whatever they want and no one will know. The second reason I love doing the question box is that it gives me as a leader, or my children's church teacher on a Sunday, or my Sunday school teacher, or my midweek small group leader, time to prepare to answer the question. They have time to dive into the Word, to dive into study resources. They don't have to answer a really hard question on a whim. Question box. Second thing I do is use discussion time differently. Instead of allowing discussion time to just be me asking kids questions, what did you learn? What did you think of today's story? What did this person do? What did that person do? I allow them to ask questions too. This has changed the way I do children's ministry. It has changed the way I teach kids. I'm not always the one asking questions, but I let them ask questions. So instead of asking them, "What did you learn about God today?" I ask, "What questions do you have about God after today's story?" If I teach them about, say, a story of Jesus, a miracle that Jesus performed, sometimes I will straight out ask them, "Do you find this hard to believe? Why do you think people may not believe it? What questions come up with God when you hear this story?" It's not always easy. Sometimes it gets messy. Sometimes it gets hard. Sometimes I leave wanting to pull my hair out. But it is worthwhile, because what I have seen is when kids know they can ask us the hard questions, their faith starts to stick. It starts to last. It starts to go from just being something that they've heard a teacher or a leader or a parent tell them they have to believe, and they've really done the deep digging for themselves, and they're able to ask those questions and know that our God is big enough to handle them. Let them ask lots of questions. So we're starting small. We're not giving them, the whole theological treatise that you read in your master's degree or in your doctorate or whatever in 1 week or even 1 year. We're giving them small chunks. Second thing we're doing is allowing them to ask us questions. Even when it's hard, even when it's scary, we let them ask questions. And the third thing is this: use interactive methods. I am such a firm believer that we do not need to teach kids theology just by reading them a lesson and having them answer questions. Sometimes that works and sometimes it's great, but theology does not need to be boring. It doesn't need to be dull. It doesn't need to feel like school all the time. We can teach kids theology in so many ways. In the slides that are on the screen, you'll see a list of a bunch of different learning methods. We know, and most of you know this, that kids learn in lots of different ways. Some kids learn by talking, some by listening, some by seeing, some by doing, some by reflecting. And the way that we teach theology should reflect this. So what that means is we need to integrate different methods in the way we teach theology. Let me give you an example of how we did this in our ministry. Last winter, we taught about the Trinity. It was challenging. It's not an easy truth to dive into. So here's what we did, okay? We looked at the Trinity in a whole host of different ways. First way we looked at it was through a video. I found a great quick video on the internet. Some of my kids are visual learners. They love to listen. They love to see. And so we played a quick video about what the Trinity is. Second thing I did was an object lesson. Some of my kids want to get their hands on things. So I did an object lesson and then I allowed them to do it too. I allowed them to get their hands on the objects and really dive in, feel, touch, hold, be able to use their bodies to learn. Then, and the most embarrassing part for me by far, was we made up a rap about the Trinity. This really appealed to my musical learners, but let me tell you, it was shamefully embarrassing for me because I have zero sense of rhythm. So we made up a rap. We let them rap Father, Spirit, Son, 3 in 1. I'm not going to do it right now. And this allowed them to really get that truth into their mind. At the end of the night, we had a reflection sheet. We allowed kids to take some time to reflect, to draw, to think, to journal on why this mattered to them. What questions did they have? And then before the night was through, we had our classic small group discussions where kids could process, talk about it, talk out loud, ask questions, hear answers, joke with their friends in a setting where they could process out loud what they learned. None of this took a lot of effort, preparation, hard work, extra on my part. It just took intentionality and time to integrate those different methods to teach kids an important truth. So when you're preparing to teach theology to your kids, remember, you can use a host of different ways to teach them theology. Even when you're playing a game that relates back to what you're teaching, when you're doing a craft, a science experiment, watching a video, singing a worship song, all of those things are teaching the kids in your care theology. It doesn't just have to be a lecture style. It doesn't just have to be when you're actually standing there inputting truth into their lives, although those things are so important. We can teach theology in so many different ways. So we start small, we ask questions, and we use different methods. We're interactive. We allow kids to enjoy what we're teaching them. Theology, and I cannot stress this enough, should not be boring. It should be exciting. Our kids should love learning about God. I'm a believer that no matter who you are, whether you're a Sunday school teacher who's been teaching for 50 years, whether you're a relatively new believer, whether you have a master's degree, whether you're a stay-at-home mom, you can do and teach theology. We just need to be intentional. We need to ask the Holy Spirit to guide us. We need to do our own work and study with reliable resources. And we can teach theology to kids. I believe that there are so many important things we can do in children's ministry. So many things I'm sure many of you are doing. But theology needs to be on that list. We need to be willing to teach the kids in our care theology and invest in the future of their faith. So friends, let's do it. I want to challenge you to teach the kids in your care theology. I want to see a generation that has been taught theology that touches their heart to cause them to love Jesus more, that touches their head, that causes them to know God and have a faith that they can stand on in this world, and that empowers their hands and their feet to go and to share that faith that has such a firm foundation, that is so well rooted in theology, a true and beautiful knowledge of God, that they're empowered to serve the church for this generation and the one to come. I believe that you can teach theology to kids. I believe it's important, and I believe we can all do it if we start small, don't overload yourself, don't stress, allow kids to ask questions even when it's really hard, and to use interactive methods, get creative to teach them.